Hello and welcome back to another episode of Ancient Historia. Today we're going to be having a look at Little Tartary, the lesser known Tartary, European Tartary, many names, but we're going to be discussing that, having a look at what the older documents have to say. We're going to be comparing that to what Wikipedia has to say. We're not going to be diving too deep because I want to cover as many of these books as I can. The history of Little Tartary, just like any country, is vast. So if you want to learn the entire thing, you're probably going to have to break out some books for yourself. But unfortunately, they do try and disguise these things under different histories, make it seem like it was not connected into a vaster system, which of course you can do with anything. So we're going to start by having a look at what Wikipedia has to say generally about Tartary. Tartary or Tatary, the Tatar coming from the extra R added at some point in our history, or Tatar as in Tatarstan. Tartary was a blanket term used in Western European literature and cartography for vast parts of Asia bounded by the Caspian Sea, the Ural Mountains, the Pacific Ocean, and the northern borders of China, India, and Persia at a time when this region was largely unknown to European geographers. So the general sentiment of that paragraph is just uneducated Westerners called the whole area Tartary. The active use of the name can be traced from the 13th century to the 19th century. In European sources, Tartary became the most common name for Central Asia that had no connection with real politics or ethnic groups of the region. Until the 19th century, European knowledge of the area remained extremely scarce and fragmentary. The region formerly known as Tartary is usually called Inner or Central Eurasia. Much of this area consists of arid plains, the main nomadic population of which in the past was engaged in animal husbandry. And then obviously it goes on to talk about the conspiracy theories of Tartary. So the general theme of what Wikipedia wants you to believe is that Tartary was just a general term for this vast section of land for uneducated Westerners that didn't have any ideas of the real history of the areas. We can argue about that, which we will do. But the other thing that they're trying to put in is that much of the area is just nomadic people that were farmers, essentially. Whereas the idea that they'd entered the Iron Age 700 to 900 years before the rest of the world, that would make their technology around 700 to 900 years more advanced. So in that aspect, they would have been a very advanced nation. And as we saw in the last video, the one about the pole shifts, we saw that Late Baikal has shown evidence of exactly that, and Late Baikal is in the heart of Tartary. Knowledge of Manchuria, Siberia, and Central Asia in Europe prior to the 18th century was limited. The 18th century is the 1700s. The entire area was known simply as Tartary, and its inhabitants, Tartars. That is inaccurate, as you'll see through reading many of these books. The people are referred to as a multitude of different names. They're never referred to as just Tartars. And the idea of this is to make it seem like Western Europeans had no clue about the area of land and then just racistly painted everyone as the same. How many people would refer to North America as Americans? And North America is massive, okay? Then you've got Canada. So you'd say, okay, you're Canadians because you're on this side of the line. But these guys, they're Americans, but they're not, really. Each state in America is bigger than most countries. By that logic, calling everybody in America an American is just as uneducated as calling everybody in Tartary a Tartarian. Do you understand where I'm coming from? So this is how they've tried to paint it. This is how they've tried to trick you. Just because they were referred to as Tartars doesn't mean that we had no knowledge of them. It just means that they all came from this one unified place. There's people that will refer to everyone from Europe as Europeans. There is a European Union, so you'd every right to refer to them as Europeans. If people from the European Union came to visit you, you'd call them Europeans. To say, oh, we had no knowledge of this thing, we just called them Tartars. It was just a vast country called Tartary. That's incorrect. These people might have been connected to this vaster place. As they'll go on to discuss, there are many different smaller versions of Tartary. And yes, in the bigger kingdom of Tartary, there were smaller vassal kingdoms that all joined together. And yes, they had wars, they had infighting, just like everywhere else. America has had civil wars, and one of them won, and now owns all of America. That's essentially what it was like in Grand Tartary. You talk about Genghis Khan, who unified the nations. Yes, he did exactly that. He won, and he took over all the places and he unified them. He said, right, we're one big country now. And then it falls to pieces, then somebody unifies it again, etc, etc. It's literally like the history of any other country, but they try and twist it to make it sound like nonsense. In the early modern period, as understanding of geography increased, Europeans began to subdivide Tartary into sections with prefixes denoting the name of the ruling power or the geographical location. Once again, this is normal. They subdivide Tartary into sections with prefixes denoting the name of the power or geographical location. So they're making it sound like it's a bad thing to subdivide areas based on geographical location. Once again, North America, South America. Oops, I just subdivided America into two things based on geographical location. The United States of America that are subdivided into states of Tennessee, Texas, Alabama, California. I'm not going to go through every state. You've got places like Virginia. Now there's a West Virginia. There's Dakota, North and South Dakota. It's nonsense, and especially by ruling power. That makes sense. It's a very normal thing to call something based on the ruling power. Example I'll give you here. There's a good example, British India. The British were in India, they called it British India because it was British-owned India. It's very simple, it's a normal thing to happen. As a result, Siberia was Great Tartary, or Russian Tartary. The Crimean Khanate was Little Tartary. Manchuria was Chinese Tartary. And Western Central Asia, prior to becoming Russian Central Asia, was known as Independent Tartary. By the 17th century, however, largely under the influence of Catholic missionary writings, the word Tartar came to refer to the Manchus and the lands they ruled as Tartary. Manchus are in the area of North China, which is Cathay, an entirely different conspiracy we've got to get into and explain, which we will do, but not today because we're going into Little Tartary. The Crimean Khanate was Little Tartary, which is what we're focusing on. Manchuria was Chinese Tartary, which was known as Cathay, which they'll try and tell you was always just China and was confused with China, but we won't get into that. We're also going to examine the Crimean Khanate, which is mentioned here, because that is a big part of it. And also this, the Western Central Asia as Independent Tartary. We've talked about this a lot in my Tartaria in the News series, where we viewed all the articles from the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, etc., which were talking all about the Russian invasion of these different places in independent Tartary, starting with Bukhara, Kokand, Khiva. Eventually they had the whole thing. If you want to learn about that, go watch that entire series. It is a long series, but there is the full video that you can watch. First map that we're going to have a peek at with some text to talk about is from John Speed from 1626. And this is a map of Russia. You can see here what Moscow looked like, which is just incredible. If you want to have a pause and have a look at some of these places, because that's the key there, and these are all the letters, obviously, you can see how detailed this is. Did a very good job of drawing that, didn't he? Notice the double eagle up here. So that's Moscow up there, and down here is Crimea, or Tartary Prekopensian, which is something that's going to come up in the other document that we've got, which I'll show you. So the other document is going to be this, a little description of the Great World, augmented and revised by Peter Halen, and it was supposedly printed in 1625. I know that we've got a copy here, which is the one we're going to be used to read because it's a bit easier, which I've pulled from this website, turned into a little PDF, talking about Tartary. So it's obviously page 659. I'm not sure if this contains the entire book. This is supposedly the text from it. I know that at some point in this, it mentions Anno 1844. So it was definitely revised after 1844 for it to have mention of that. I'm not sure if that's in the original book, because if that's in this book, then that means that this has come out after 1850, which might make a bit more sense, because it does look quite good condition for something that's supposedly come out in 1625. Then we've also got more to talk about from 1680 and one more from 1721 that we'll talk about as well. So we'll focus on these now. Now, one of the most interesting things about our 1626 John Speed map of Russia, as you will see, is that it seems to suggest that this entire area here is under control of Crimean Tartary, which might even extend down to Caucasia. And these guys, at one point, were probably considered the most important Tartars. These were the ones that actually ruled Moscow. These guys were actually in control of Moscow for quite some many years before they were overthrown by the Muscovites. But something interesting is what appears to be a system going all the way around Little Tartary. So your entire access point to Asia from this section has got a wall here. And you'll notice it goes from river to river. Obviously, rivers acting as a natural barrier. Coming in, we can see that it's definitely drawn as if to be a mountain or hill mounds, so possibly a dike. And it's also got these towers which would insinuate these are checkpoints or places for you to possibly get through, places for you to pay your taxes. So that's very interesting because you can't find anything about a giant wall being constructed from the Volga, all the way to the Dnieper. It's quite crazy. Coming to the page which talks about Tartary, John Sennick's book, page 40, we have found Tartaria Minor is called likewise Horda Pracapensium. Now, Horda, the horde, is just a word for the army. It's actually where our English word for order probably comes from. From Horda, order, armies have order. So yes, it's the armies really. The Russians, their armies were literally called orders. So lots of people, particularly like Fomenko, suggested that that's insinuates that the Russians were the ones that had this empire, and obviously considering Tartary is Russia, I suppose that's not too far from the truth. But Order Pracapensium, a force of Tartars which have their name from one city, Prekops, but inhabit all of those plains which lie round about the Pontus Exinus, or Mare Magor, and Palus Meotis, including the whole Taurica Chersonesus, so that she extends her limits from the banks of the river Borysthenes as far as Tanne. Her chief province is the Chersonesus, a peninsula 70 miles in compass, which took the name of Taurica from Osiris. That's very interesting. Osiris, of course, being the Egyptian. It was invaded by one Eulanus, from whom the inhabitants of this whole region were sometimes called Eulani. Oh, that's strange, isn't it? I thought that everybody just called them Tartars in the 1600s. But this guy's calling them Eulani, as they were after Crim Tartars, from that city, Crim, once the king's seat of this peninsula, though it stood not within her limits, for her principal town was Theodosia, now Kassa, where there was heretofore a colony of Genoese, till they were dispossessed by Mahomet, the 8th emperor of the Turks. The other towns of this Tartaria Pracapensis, which stand without the Chersonesus, are Okazan, which the people took from the dukes of Lithuania and Tanas, which stands in the utmost part of this Tartaria, above the mouth of the river Tanai, some 3 miles distant. It is called by the inhabitants Azak, and is a place of great traffic and free access for many neighbouring nations. I can never ignore Magog, which is over here, talking about Tartaria Antiqua, which is something that's going to come up a lot. Chinchis, which is obviously Genghis, and his Tartars taking over that land. So if you haven't seen our Gog Magog video, go see that, because that'll give you some information. Oh, it also talks about the kingdom of Tabor. This is really interesting, because the kingdom of Tabor supposedly had a king in 1540 who was Jewish, who went to Europe, and he was burnt at the stake in Mantua by Charles V. But just wanted to bring that up because it's very interesting. I'm trying to find Tabor, but we can't. Talks about Ani and Argan, Tenduk and Mongol. If you haven't seen videos that talk about Tenduk, go and watch the Gog and Magog and the Bargu video. Now it comes to our 1680 book, which talks Little Tartary. This one is Robert Morden, I believe. Yep, Robert Morden. Actually talks about Tartaria in Europe. Yeah, by Robert Morden. So here is the map. If you want to see it a bit longer, make sure to pause. Here is the Dnieper, and here is the Don and Tanai. So if we just come back to the 1626 map to get an idea of where we're looking at. So, does that indicate that over 100 years, Lesser Tartary has shrunk down? Because obviously this is going all the way over here. Would imply some of these areas must be part of it. So it comes to the 1680. So this one's only 60 years. Sorry, not 100 years. Next one, there'll be 100 years. But 60 years have gone by. And this is what it's saying Tartaria in Europe is. We can see Moscovia up here. So 1680, assuming this is the boundary. You see the Nogoi Tartars over there. Sometimes called the Noyan Tartars. Because they be annoying those Russians. What's cool is we see the city called Cambra, which is quite interesting. We see a lot of Cams in Britain, like Cambria, Cambridgeshire, Camelots. There are loads. When it comes to Tartars, the insinuation can be that it comes from Sham or Khan. Sham and Khan being the ruler of the area. So that might literally be where the Sham lives. But you'd assume he would be here in Crimea, which we can have a look at today. We're going to actually have a peek at 4 of the cities that have been mentioned. This one down here, Kassa, we're going to have a look at that. And we're also going to have a look at Krim, Prekop, and Okazau. So this today is obviously modern-day Ukraine, or this bit. This bit is at war right now. These are the areas that have been occupied by Russia. And obviously Crimea has as well. Notice as well, up here we have Ungul. And we know that Ung means Gog, like Gog and Magog. The Lesser Tartary, which lies in Europe, is so called to distinguish it from the Grand, which makes part of Asia. It is also called Pergapensis and Krim from the names of the principal cities, situated in the peninsula formerly called Taurica Chersonesus. Just as an example, by the way, of them using sham, this is from a document on the National Library of Scotland. We could probably talk about this as well at some point. There's so much for us to discuss, and I don't want to bore you guys, because I don't know how many of you just want to listen to me read entire documents, because to me that would seem boring, just listening to someone do that. I just really don't want to ruin it for you guys. You know, history, learning should be fun. But this is an example, so it's the character of Sultan Galga, the present Sham of Tartary. We're not going to be reading it. It was just an example of them using sham, which is essentially like a prince or a king. It can even be an emperor. They do use the word emperor as well. It's definitely related directly to the word Khan. So you can see how Khanate is a Shamit. So a Khan of a Khanate. You also have caliphs from caliphates, sultans from sultanates. I just thought I'd bring you to this Encyclopedia Britannica from 1797. Just for a quick look at what this has to say. Tartan, in sea language, a small coasting vessel, navigated in the Mediterranean Sea, and having only one mast and a bowsprit. The principal sail, which is extremely large, being extended by a lateen yard. Why would a specifically Mediterranean boat be called a tartan boat? Unless, of course, the Tartars used that specific boat in the Mediterranean. We know the Tartars were most likely the Barbar coast, the barbarians from the Barbary coast. That's a cool connection. Also, here under Tartary, and bearing in mind this is 1797, so Wikipedia says, you know, by the 18th, 19th century, people were starting to get information about the area and not use these terms, but bearing in mind it literally does describe that it's bounded on the north by Siberia, or the part of Asia which belongs to Russia. It's bounded on the west by the rivers Don, Volga, and Kama, which separates it from Russia. It's bounded on the south by the Euxine and Caspian seas. Karazm, the two Bacarias, so that's Karazm, as in independent Tartary. The two Bacarias, we talked about Baccaria and Kokand, Khiva from independent Tartary. China and Korea. and on the east by the Oriental or Tartarian Ocean. So what would that tell us? Let's have a quick look at the map. So we're just going to quickly try and work out exactly where it's saying Tartaria is, where it's telling us in 1797 the country of Tartary was, okay, which was divided into East and West Tartary. It said that it was bounded on the north by Russian Siberia. So we don't know exactly where that is, okay, so we'll put a little pin here. Okay, we can work out that this is the Khanate of Bukhara. So when it said the two Bukharas on the south, China, Korea, and on the east is the ocean. Okay, so it's bounded on its south by China and Korea. So we've just added on just a little marker, China, south for China, and there's for Korea. The reason we're saying China's here is because looking at this 1682 map, which shows Tartary here, and you can quite clearly see that Korea here and the Great Wall of China here, and that essentially is the border. We do know that the Wall of China was literally built to defend against the Tartars, because this map literally tells us a wall of 400 leagues built between the bottoms of the mountains by the King of China against the incursions of the Tartars. So we know that the Great Wall of China was built specifically to keep the Tartars out. So it'd be a bit stupid, wouldn't it, to build it halfway into your country? So we know that that means that's the border of China. This map shows us that we actually have a Bukharia down here, which explains why there were two Bukharias, and it shows us Kharazm is on the left. Sorry for the movement, it moves with the mouse. But yeah, we got Kharazm on the left, so we know that this must be the border for Tartary here. We know that on the west, it was bounded by the river Don, Volga, and Kama. Quick look at this map shows us the Don right here. The Volga being the big one that comes up here with Astrakhan and Kazan. These, of course, used to be Tartarian cities, so these most likely at this point still are if they haven't fallen yet. And Kama is this one. Not as easy to work out on this, but this is the Volga going up here. That's the Don there. And the Volga comes all the way around, and the Kama goes off here. So this is our western border. So, bearing in mind it did say that Siberia in the north was bounded, so we assume this is Siberia. If the Kama is the boundary and it's here, this must have all been Tartary, all the way around here, all the way up here to the Eastern Ocean. Excuse the really crude attempt at this drawing, but this at the very least is what this is describing this country as, and says it's divided to West and Eastern Tartary. I don't know how far up here it extends. It does say Western Tartary is much more extensive than the Eastern, so perhaps I should have shrunk the Eastern size down a bit. But the main point to take away is that at the beginning of the 1800s, at the very end of the 1700s, Tartary was definitely something around this size. And there's no doubt about that. And obviously Little Tartary, considering we saw that Little Tartary was this section here, extending up to this river, we saw that possible boundary on our map, which extended from this river all the way to this river, which would have extended all the way from the Volga to the Dnieper. So it's very interesting. Can anybody find any evidence of something going all the way across these areas? Because if you can find evidence for that, that would be absolutely incredible. Maybe it's been destroyed. It did look like it was making use of mountains, but there was definitely buildings in there. 100% buildings, implying that this is some kind of man-made mound structure, perhaps. Maybe it's not mountains, but hills, muddy dikes and things. I don't know. So, we were talking about Taurica Chersonesus, and now the official narrative says that the Tartars first appeared in Europe in 1168 AD, when they took the Taurica Chersonesus, supposedly, or presumably, from the early Muscovites. What is interesting is that Chersonesus was founded by the Greeks, so it does raise questions about whether it was whether perhaps the Greek Empire was hanging around a bit later than they're made out to be. Maybe they're not as ancient as we think, which would make sense. Perhaps the Greek Empire has supplanted the Tartarian history in Constantinople around Turkey, Asia Minor, into Armenia and sections of Macedonia, etc. It's possible. But, going on to this, the Nogay Tartars must not be omitted. They lie between the Tanai and Volga, nor the Tartars of Okazau, between the mouth of Borysthenes and the Dniester, nor the Tartars of Budziak, already mentioned, to the east of Moldavia, between the mouths of the Dniester and Donau. Besides all these are some that are settled also in Lithuania and Ukraine. Crim Tartary is a peninsula about 200 miles in length and 50 in breadth, wonderfully populous and exceeding fruitful, abounding in corn and grass. Well, everyone loves a bit of grass, but wood and fuel is scarce. The towns on the seaside are Prekop, Lusiowa, Mankup, Krim, Kassa, Kurs, Botka, which lies between the Black and Moetan or Ratan seas, near to which is a great field 50 miles long, enclosed with water, where the Tartars in winter do keep their herges or horses. Within the land are Karasu and Bakassi Sere. The town of Astamgorod stands upon the Dnieper. In former times there dwelt in two brothers, Ingul and Ungul, who, falling at variance, and that ending in cruel wars, the whole country adjacent, though pleasant and fruitful, became a wilderness, and now lieth waste, being a vast desert 500 miles over and 1,000 miles long, from Prekop unto the county of Muscovy. So it's saying in former times there were two brothers called Ingul and Ungul who had a war which caused the country to become a desert 500 miles over and 1,000 miles long. Between Prekop and Muscovy, a desert, what kind of war was that? We'll have to look more into that. Kassa, known to the ancients by the name of Theodosia, is a great city and place of good trade, wherein above 1,000 families of Armenians and above 500 Greeks, who have their several bishops and churches. That of St. Peter's is the biggest, but fallen to decay. Every Christian above 15 years of age pays a piaster and half tribute to the Grand Signior, who is lord of the city, formerly possessed by the Genoese, but taken by Mahomet the Great in 1475. It hath since been subject to the Turks. When it talks of Mahomet the Great, it's presumably talking about Mehmed II, which sometimes, by some Russian historians that believe in the Fomenko theories, they believe that Mehmed and Muhammad are one and the same person, and that Islam was actually an offshoot of Nestorian Christianity that appeared in about the 1400s. That would insinuate that Muhammad, he believed that Christianity had been tainted by the Roman Catholics. So in that sense, Islam was actually a branch off of Nestorian Christianity. And you can also see here, Mehmed was Caesar of Rome. Caesar, the Tsar, that's where it comes from, the Tsar, Caesar. Also, I just wanted to bring notice to this. It's an article from Chicago, 1877, but this is noting something that seemingly occurred in 1711, which is war declared by the Sham of Tartary, declaring war on the Tsar of Russia. So in 1711, the Sham of Tartary was entering into a war with the Tsar or Caesar of Russia. That also brings into question who really were people like Julius Caesar, if they were in fact the Tsar, Julius the Tsar. Does bring up a lot of questions. Back to this. Prekop, in Latin Precopia, seated near the place where the Eupatria of the ancients stood. Bakisisare or Bafasarail is the residence or court of the present Khans of Tartary. You can see here it's spelled with a K, K-A-N-S, the Khans of Tartary. Mankup is a strong town where the Khan is said to keep his treasury. German or Krim was the ancient seat of the Khans, supposed to be the Tafre of Pliny or Tafras of Ptolemy. Why is it called German, eh? Well, we know why. Because the Huns were also from these regions. The Germans, the Huns, the Goths, they all seem to stem from this city and region. So that's interesting that the city of Krim was possibly called German. Kurs stands upon the Bosphorus Camarius or the Strait of Kaffa, not far from the Pantacapium of the ancients. Okazau is situated near the influx of the great river Borysthenes, built in or near the place of Olbia. The Tanai of Ptolemy, situated on the mouth of that river, is the last city in Europe now subject to the Turks, who have there a garrison and by them called Azak or Azau. The ancient inhabitants of the European Tartary or Sarmatia Europea were of the Scythian race. But in Chersonesus itself dwelt the ancient Tauri, against whom Darius, king of Persia, made his fruitless war with an army of 700,000, which again, very interesting. I've heard a lot about Darius, because Darius and the Persians were supposedly vast enemies of the Greeks. So when I said it seems like the Greek Empire has kind of had this history supplanted, this could be very related. Because how were these people appearing thousands of years ago, disappearing, and then reappearing in our recent times? It's very convenient. But in the actions of the Greeks and Romans, we hear nothing of them, unless that the Emperor Trajan took the city Tafra. Trajan obviously being the Roman Empire Trajan. Afterwards, growing great by conquering the Asiatic Tartars, Muhammad the Great made himself master of Kassa and Azau, thereby commanding both Maeotis and the Euxine Seas, so that Mehmed the Great that we saw, Caesar of Russia, actually made his base in the city of Kassa and Azau. He was commanding from there. He was the master of Kassa and Azau. He seemed to be living there. And in the times of Selimus I, who had married a daughter of this Crim Tartar, the Turks and Tartars grew into a league. And though the Khan or Prince be elective, yet he is chosen out of the true line and confirmed by the Grand Signior, who have always taken upon them the power to dispose the father and constitute the son, or next of that lineage, when found remiss in affording their auxiliary helps to the war, or guilty of any disrespect, or want to duty the Ottoman port. So there are some quite interesting things there. So the Khan or Prince be elective. They elected their Khans, yet they elected them out of people that were of the true line. This is something we actually have seen across Europe, particularly in Wales, where essentially when the king died, anyone related to him had a right to the throne, and they'd get together and have a big vote, and whoever won, kind of like a Game of Thrones style thing, whoever won became the new king. So it was a very elective system, but still based on nepotism. You still had to be of true lineage, which is why a lot of these places, when a new king was taking over, he'd have to marry into the family somewhere. He'd have to take like a cousin or something. Then he would be part of the family. Another interesting thing is that, yeah, he took over, so Muhammad the Great made himself master of Kassa and Azau, thereby commanding both Maeotis and Euxine Seas. So he took control of these areas himself. This guy, the Caesar of Russia, took control of it in 1475. The Tartars are esteemed as brothers or near allies with the Turks, to whom, for want of heirs male in the Ottoman line, the Turkish Empire is by an ancient compact to descend, the expectation of which doth keep the Tartars in much observance, in hopes one day to be lords of the world. Basically saying the Turks and the Tartars are very closely related, and they think that when and in fact the Turkish line, the family of the Ottoman empires, are connected with the Tartars, which again is something Fomenko talks about, that the Tartars and the Ottomans or the Byzantines would regularly intermarry. Trade princes and princesses happened all the time. In the year 1663, the Tartars called to the assistance of the Turks, made such incursions into Hungary, Moravia, and Silesia, sacking and burning cities and towns, that they carried away 160,000 captives, which they sell to the Turks, who go thither to trade for this merchandise, which is the most profitable commodity that Tartary affords. Young boys and girls are rated at the highest price. Oh god, I'm going to get demonetized. The latter, if beautiful, are like jewels, held at an unknown value, though few of them escape the lust of the Tartars. Wow, this is just sad now. Sorry about this, guys. Oh, it always takes a dark turn when you read history. But they live very hardly and feed especially on horseflesh. Now, this kind of stuff I've heard is absolute nonsense, because here's going to be the best example. Let's say these Tartars truly are monsters like this, and they're feasting on their horses. They drink the blood of their horses, which I'm pretty certain it might say somewhere. They say they drink the blood of their horses. And they live in tents, and they're savage people. Yet, we have evidence of the Byzantine and the Ottoman empires, as in the emperors of Constantinople, sending their princesses to go and marry into Tartar prince lineages. If you were the princess of Constantinople, living in a beautiful palace, Would you really want to go and eat horse flesh in the woods with your new husband? I don't think so. So this idea that they were just horsemen and they had nothing, this is just to basically cover up the idea that the Russians have destroyed their houses. Like this essentially now just goes into saying that they are, that they eat raw flesh and stuff like that. But it just tries to make them sound like brutes, which unfortunately is the way it goes because it's written by the victor. And we're just going to briefly look at what Wikipedia has to say about the Crimean Khanate because obviously that's important to this situation. We've got the another map here as well showing the area of Little Prekop or Crimean Tartary, as you can see. We're also going to go and have a look at these cities once we've peeked at the Crimean Khanate. So, the self-defined as the throne of Crimea in old European historiography and geography known as Little Tartary. Deshtik Kipchak is something that comes up quite a bit. If you've watched our video on Tamerlane, go and watch that, but that comes up with Deshtik Kipchak quite a bit. It was a Crimean Tartar state existing from 1441 to 1783, the longest lived of the Turkic Khanates that succeeded the empire of the Golden Horde. Golden Horde, of course, being what you would consider Genghis Khan's Mongol empire that took over the world for a bit. It was established by Achi Jireh in 1441. It was regarded as the direct heir to the Golden Horde and to Deshtik Kipchak, which means the Crimean Khanate was the center for the empire. Very interesting when you consider all the size of the thing, and it was focused there. In 1783, violating the 1774 Treaty of Küçükçayırca, which guaranteed non-interference of both Russia and the Ottoman Empire in the affairs of the Crimean Khanate, the Russian Empire annexed the Khanate. Among the European powers, only France came out with an open protest against this act due to the long-standing Franco-Ottoman alliance. Then in the middle of the 1800s, there was the Crimean War, which was fought from October 1853 to February 1856 between Russia and an ultimately victorious alliance of the Ottoman Empire, France, the United Kingdom, and Sardinia-Piedmont. The war ended with 450,000 losses on the Russian side and 165,000 losses on the Allied forces side, which was a combination of Ottoman, French, British, and Sardinian troops, with Sardinia actually only taking 28 combat deaths and most of their dead being non-combat deaths, and France and the Ottomans taking a very even amount of combat deaths, but then for some reason France lost 75,000 to non-combat deaths, which presumably comes out to things like disease. If someone doesn't die of their wounds, perhaps they get a disease and die after, I don't know. But it's a lot of people to die. Russia apparently deployed 325,000 troops during this. We can go more into this at some point. I'll do a video on the Crimean War, but it's not the main thing. We're talking about the Khanate. But the Crimean Khans, considering their state as the heir and successor of the Golden Horde, called themselves Khans of the Great Horde, the Great State, and the Throne of Crimea. An example here, Crimean Tartar, known as Crimean. And you can see that English-speaking writers during the 18th and early 19th centuries often called the territory Little Tartary. The official history, according to mainstream historians, is that Turkic people of the first Turkish Khaganate invaded in the 6th century, and then in the 11th century, Cumans or Kipchaks appeared, who became the rulers, and then about 100 to 200 years later, the Tartars, Mongols, or whatever you want to be known as, the people coming under Genghis Khan's hordes, they took over. What's interesting is the first formally recognized ruler is considered Aran Timur, the nephew of Batu Khan, but we don't have a page for Timur. Anyway, we'll finally come to this book that we're going to look at. Only a brief section that I want to pull us to. We've got the English version, which we are going to try and check. Although, unfortunately, as I click through it, I think it does look like, whilst they do include Barbary, I think they've missed out Tartary. Hopefully it's further on, but no, unfortunately they've missed out the section on Tartary. So if anyone can find us the original of this book, I will have a look myself, but it's called that, that's the name there. Okay, so if we can find the original of this book, because as I said before, this one had mentions of something that happened in 1844. which is impossible for a book written in 1625 unless you're Doctor Who. So yeah, this book, I'm going to zoom out a bit, this book talks a lot about the great Shams of Tartary, as you can see from 1162. Doesn't seem to name them after that. I like the guy Alan, he's my favourite. As for the Tartars, they are by some supposed to be the offspring of the 10 tribes whom Salmanasar led away captured, and that especially for two reasons. The first, that the word Tartari, by which name they rather ought to be called than by that of Tartary, signify in the Syriac and Hebrew tongues a remnant. To this we answer that the name of the people is derived from the river Tartar, as some, or from the region called Tartar, where they first dwelt, as most think. So, they're trying to insinuate here, again, this is debunking it, that the Tatari are the descendants of the tribes of Israel, the 13th tribe, the Ashkenazis, all related to that. You want to read a book called The 13th Tribe if you want to see more about that. But it is a notion that could be being obscured purposely. We come down to this section, because we don't need to go over all this before. They talk about them using circumcision and stuff like that. Tartaria is now visually divided into these parts: Precapensum, Asiaticum, Antiquum, Zagathe, and Cathay. Tartaria Precapensis containeth all Taurica Chersonesus and the Asiatican banks of Tanai. The chief cities are Precops, whence the whole nation is called Precapensis; Crim, the ancient seat of the Tartarian rulers, whence named they were the Crim Tartars; Oczakau, the residence of the present princes, so that's Okazau was actually residence of the present Khans; and Kaffa, anciently Theodosia, a town of great traffic, which Mohammed the Great took from the Genasi. The Tartarians were first placed in this country by Bado or Roido, which is Batu Khan, a brave captain which subdued all Moscovia. Mohammed the Great contracted with them a league that the Tartars should aid the Turks on all occasions with 60,000 men, and those to demand no pay. To requite that which the Tartar is to succeed in the Turkish Empire, if at any time the issue made should happen to fail. After this covenant, the Great Turk used to send the new elected Sham a banner as a token of his approbation of their election. So, the Ottoman Empire supported the Shams of Tartary after 1475, when Mohammed the Great, Mehmed II, seemed to take over, but then he became Tsar of Russia. It's very interesting as well, because if you've seen our Tamerlane specials, you'll see how Tamerlane fought to protect Constantinople, supposedly from these same Ottoman forces. He protected the Greeks against these Ottomans, but then 50 years later, the Ottomans succeeded, and then Mehmed the Great carried on and seemingly took Russia as well. So became the Caesar of Russia. Or did he come from Russia? These are the questions that we've got to ask. So the four main cities that were mentioned in that little document we just saw: Perikop, which is an urban type settlement located on the Perikop, connecting the Crimean Peninsula to the Ukrainian mainland. It is known for the Or Qapi fortress, which served as the gateway to Crimea. This is a super low quality image. Look at this. This apparently is the entrance to Crimea. Look at the size of this wall. That's insane. Wow. Just ruins today, but you can see the size of this dike. Would have been filled with all kinds of things, and that's all we've got. We've got one picture, and that. We have found this picture, which, look at the size of this wall. So that's absolutely incredible. They would have had this going for miles. Absolutely miles. This seems like something that should be on the front cover of every tourist advertisement for Ukraine. They should be reconstructing this thing, because I can't believe they've just let it go to ruin. Look at it.